Boots. By 11:40 that night, one badge would already be sitting face down on a metal desk under fluorescent light. One department would be staring at a federal inquiry letter. Nobody in the building knew how to answer, and one dashcam clip would have 300,000 views before the sun came up over Thorncastle County. Boots. But at 9:52 p.m., all Simone Calloway knew was that a police officer had his palm flat against the bars, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, telling her she'd better start talking if she didn't want to spend the weekend in county lockup. Boots. You want to explain yourself now? Officer Dale Kessler's voice bounced hard off the concrete block walls of the holding corridor. Boots. Or are we going to keep doing the silent treatment? Simone didn't move. She stood inside the cell with her hands loosely folded in front of her, blazer still buttoned despite the 2 hours she'd already spent in it, and looked at him the way a person looks at a decision they made a long time ago and never had reason to revisit. Boots. I've told you everything I'm authorized to tell you, she said quietly. If you'd called the number on the wall before you cuffed me, we wouldn't be standing here. Boots. Authorized. Kessler repeated the word like it tasted wrong going down. Lady, you were standing outside a restricted perimeter at 9 o'clock at night, refusing to answer basic questions. Boots. That's not authorization. That's suspicious behavior, plain and simple. Behind him, 24-year-old Officer Eli Sandoval shifted his weight against the doorframe and said nothing. Boots. His eyes moved between his training officer and the woman behind the bars, like he was watching two different versions of the same 10 minutes collide in real time. Boots. 90 minutes earlier, none of this had existed. A patrol car had rolled past the Belhaven Municipal Annex, a squat brick building on Route 9 that housed nothing more exciting than water authority records, and on the third floor, a server room nobody in town thought twice about. Boots. Near the loading dock, a woman in a navy blazer had been standing with a tablet in one hand, tracing something along the exterior wall with the other. Boots. Kessler had pulled up expecting a vagrant, or worse, someone casing the place for copper wire. What he'd found instead was a woman in business clothes, who, when asked what she was doing, had answered only, "I'm here on a scheduled infrastructure assessment." Boots. I can't discuss the specifics tonight, but the after-hours contact card on the wall behind you will confirm everything in under 2 minutes. Boots. It was a strange answer. It was not an illegal one. Ma'am, I need you to explain what you're doing at a restricted facility after hours, Kessler had said. Boots. I understand the question, Simone had answered. And that, though nobody in that parking lot would understand it for hours, was the moment the whole night tipped over. Boots. Kessler heard understand and not answer, and something in him, something that had been sitting under the skin since a reprimand 3 weeks earlier, bristled at being handled instead of obeyed. Boots. That's not what I asked. I know. I'm telling you I can confirm I have full legal authorization to be here. Boots. I'm not able to disclose the specifics of the assessment tonight. If you call the placard number, dispatch will verify it in under 2 minutes. Boots. 2 minutes. Boots. Sandoval would remember that number for a long time. How close they'd come. How simple it would have been. How his training officer had looked directly at the laminated card bolted to the brick 6 feet from his shoulder and decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with the woman in front of him and everything to do with a demotion letter still sitting unopened in a drawer at home, that he wasn't going to be told what to do by someone who wouldn't just answer a question. Boots. You're not able to disclose, Kessler had repeated, stepping closer, or you don't have anything to disclose. Those aren't the same thing, ma'am. Boots. That was when his jaw had tightened in the particular way. Sandoval had learned to read over 4 months of riding with him, the tell that came right before Kessler stopped listening to anything at all. Boots. Hands behind your back. You don't have to do this, Simone had said, and there was no fear in it, only something closer to disappointment. The tone of a person watching someone walk toward a cliff edge they'd already been warned about. Boots. You have a much easier option sitting right there on that wall, hands behind your back. She hadn't fought it. Boots. She hadn't raised her voice. She had simply turned, laced her fingers together, and let the cuffs click shut around her wrists with the calm of someone who had already run this math before and already knew how it would end. She just didn't know yet how long it would take to get there. Boots. What Kessler didn't know, what he never once thought to ask, was that Simone Calloway had grown up watching her father live inside exactly this kind of moment. Boots. Walter Calloway had spent 31 years as a night security guard at a chemical distribution plant outside Raleigh, and one October evening when Simone was 11, two officers pulled him out of his own guard shack in handcuffs because a supervisor 3 states away hadn't answered a verification call fast enough. Boots. He'd spent 6 hours in a cell before anyone corrected the mistake. He never got an apology. He went back to work the next night anyway, because the bills didn't care what had happened to him, and he never once raised his voice about it in front of his daughter. Not that night. Not in the 20 years after. Boots. Simone had built her entire career on the 2-minute phone call. Nobody had bothered to make for her father, and some nights, standing exactly where she was standing now, she could still hear the particular quiet he used to go into after a bad shift. The quiet that wasn't peace either. Boots. A man walking his dog had paused at the corner, phone rising halfway before dropping again, when nothing more dramatic seemed to be happening. Boots. A jogger had slowed near the crosswalk, watched beat too long, then kept running. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. Boots. There is a particular kind of silence that isn't peace. It's permission. Simone had felt it settle over that parking lot the second the cuffs closed, the way she had felt it settle over other rooms, other years, other versions of the same collision, long before this one. Boots. Kessler had not always been the kind of officer who let a demotion sit in his chest like a stone. Boots. 3 weeks earlier, he'd been Sergeant Dale Kessler, 22 years on the force, until a routine domestic call had gone sideways, and he'd put a 19-year-old boy face down on a driveway hard enough to dislocate a shoulder. A boy, it turned out, who had called the police himself to report the disturbance, not caused it. Boots. The review board hadn't fired him. Boots. They'd busted him back to patrol and buried the letter in his file, and every single person at that precinct understood, without anyone saying it out loud, that Dale Kessler had spent every shift since then looking for a moment where he could be right again, decisively, publicly, in a way nobody could take from him. Boots. He had walked into that parking lot on Route 9 already primed to find one. Simone Calloway, calm and unreadable and unwilling to explain herself on his timetable, had simply been standing there when he needed her to be. Boots. Now, in the holding block, Kessler was getting louder, precisely because she refused to get louder with him, and Sandoval was starting to understand, really understand, in the pit of his stomach, that the volume wasn't for her anymore. Boots. It was for himself. "You people always think there's some magic phrase that gets you out of trouble," Kessler said. Boots. Restricted assessment. Can't disclose. "You have any idea how many times I've heard some version of that line?" "I don't think you have," Simone said. Boots. Not like this one. Something about the stillness in her voice made Sandoval's stomach turn over slowly, the exact feeling he got right before a call went bad in a way nobody could walk back. Boots. Kessler laughed, short and humorless, and turned toward the door like the conversation was already over, already won. "Enjoy the night," he said. Boots. "Judge sees you Monday morning. Maybe by then you'll remember how to answer a simple question." He wasn't finished, though. Boots. He turned back once more, hands slapping flat against the bars hard enough that the sound cracked down the corridor like a snapped branch, and Sandoval flinched even though he was 10 feet away and behind a wall of steel himself. Boots. "You know what," Kessler said. "I think I'm going to add obstruction on top of trespassing. And maybe resisting, since you didn't exactly make this easy on anybody." Boots. It wasn't true. She had done everything he'd asked, the second he'd asked it, hands laced together before he'd even finished the sentence. Boots. Everyone in that hallway knew it wasn't true. He said it anyway, because at that moment the charge sheet was the only thing left in the room he still had control over, and men like Dale Kessler will always reach for the one lever still working in their hand, whether or not it holds any weight. Boots. Simone didn't call after him. She waited until his boots had faded down the corridor, and then she looked up at the clock mounted above the booking desk, visible through the narrow window in the cell door, and said, quiet enough that only Sandoval, still lingering at the frame, could hear it, 4 minutes. Boots. He frowned. 4 minutes for what? She held his gaze a long moment, and for the first time all night, something that might have been sympathy crossed her face, not for herself, but for him. Boots. You're about to find out, she said, and I'd start thinking now about what you're going to say when they ask you why you didn't make that phone call. Boots. Down the hallway, at the front desk, the line was already lighting up. Before we go any further, stay with this one, because what happens in the next 20 minutes is the part everyone in that building will spend the next 11 weeks trying to explain. Boots. The phone had rung 4 times before anyone answered it. Nora Faulkner, the night desk clerk, picked it up on the 5th ring with the flat practiced tone of someone who had fielded 1,000 wrong numbers and fully expected this to be the 1,001st. Boots. Bellhaven PD front desk. This is Ironclad Site Services. Calling regarding a missed check-in for contractor badge 4419. Can you confirm whether an individual named Simone Calloway is currently in your custody? Boots. Nora's pen stopped above the log sheet. I'm sorry, who is this? Ironclad Site Services. We monitor scheduled infrastructure assessments under several federal and municipal contracts. Boots. Ms. Calloway missed a mandatory 90-minute safety check-in at the Bellhaven Annex approximately 40 minutes ago. Our system flagged her last known GPS position as your patrol unit's location. Boots. Nora glanced toward the holding block where the overhead light hummed against the quiet. Yes, she's here. She was brought in for... Boots. Is she safe? The question landed strangely, not what she charged with, not when will she be released, just, is she safe? Boots. She's fine, Nora said slowly. She's in a cell. There was a pause on the line, brief but audible, the kind of pause that told Nora someone on the other end was writing something down, word for word. Boots. Understood. Please advise your supervising officer that failure to reach Ms. Calloway within the next hour will trigger an automatic escalation to her contracting authority. Boots. That's simply how the protocol is written. Thank you for confirming her status. The line went dead before Nora could ask anything else. Boots. She sat there a moment, the receiver still warm against her palm, turning the phrase contracting authority escalation over in her mind. Boots. 6 years at that desk, and she had never once taken a call like it, not for a DUI, not for a domestic. Boots. Not even for the county commissioner's nephew last spring, which had generated plenty of strange calls. But none of them this calm, this procedural, this certain. Boots. She got up and walked back toward booking, where Kessler was leaning against the counter, finishing a form with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who considered his night's work already done. Boots. Officer Kessler. She caught herself. He hadn't been a sergeant in 3 weeks, not since the reprimand, but old habits from before the demotion still slipped out sometimes, and he never once corrected them. Boots. I just took a strange call about the woman in holding. He didn't look up. Strange how? Some private security company. Boots. Said she missed a check-in for a federal contract, asked if she was safe. That got his attention, but not the way Nora expected. Boots. He smirked, capped his pen, and shook his head like she'd told him a joke. Private security company, he repeated. Boots. You know how many of those exist? Half of them are some guy with a laptop and a website. She's probably running for some rent-a-cop outfit that patrols parking garages and wants everybody to think it's Langley. Boots. He slid the form toward her. Log it, file it. If it's real, they'll call the actual courthouse in the morning. Boots. Nora hesitated. They said an hour, and then it escalates to her contracting authority. Nora. He said her name with the particular weariness of a man reminding everyone in the room, including himself, that he still outranked it, even if the paperwork said otherwise. Boots. I've been doing this 22 years. People throw around scary words to get out of trouble. Oldest trick in the book. Boots. He walked toward the break room. Nora stood there a moment with the log sheet in her hand before she went back to her desk and did exactly what he'd told her to do. Boots. She didn't see Sandoval standing in the hallway, close enough to have heard every word of it, his jaw tight in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. Boots. The second call came 19 minutes later, and this time Kessler grabbed the phone himself, mostly to prove a point. Boots. Bellhaven PD. This is Director Rosalind Kent, Critical Infrastructure Protection Liaison Office. I need to speak to whoever is currently holding Simone Calloway. Boots. Kessler's smirk didn't fade immediately. It took him a full second, 1 second longer than it should have, to register that the voice on the other end wasn't asking. Boots. It was informing. That'd be me, he said, dragging the words out, still performing for an audience that wasn't in the room anymore. Boots. And who exactly are you again? I'll say it once. Critical Infrastructure Protection Liaison Office. Ms. Calloway is under federal contract. Conducting a scheduled security review of a facility your department is apparently unaware requires federal notification before any local law enforcement contact. Boots. Her detainment has interrupted an active assessment window that cannot simply be rescheduled. I need her released, and I need to know the exact charges filed against her. Boots. Kessler's mouth opened, then shut. Something in his chest, small, unfamiliar, unwelcome, tightened. She was uncooperative during a lawful stop, he said, and heard for the first time that night exactly how thin that sentence sounded out loud. Boots. Define uncooperative. She wouldn't answer my questions directly. There was a silence on the line long enough that Kessler almost said hello, just to check the call hadn't dropped. Boots. When the voice came back, it had changed. Not louder, but colder. The way still water gets colder, the deeper you go. Boots. Officer, I'd advise you to write down, word for word, everything you just told me, because you're going to be asked to repeat it very soon, to people considerably less patient than I am. Boots. The line clicked off. Kessler stood at the desk, holding the dead receiver a beat too long before he set it down. Boots. Down the corridor, through the narrow window in the cell door, Simone Calloway hadn't moved, hands still folded, the fluorescent light catching the calm, unreadable line of her jaw, as if she'd already heard both calls from 30 feet away and found nothing in them worth reacting to. Boots. Sandoval appeared in the break room doorway, arms crossed. You want to tell me what that was? Kessler didn't answer right away. Boots. He was still staring down the hall at the woman who hadn't so much as glanced up, and for the first time since the traffic stop began, a small, cold seed of doubt he would have laughed off an hour ago had started unmistakably to grow. Boots. The phone on the desk began ringing again. Neither of them moved for it right away. Sandoval got there first. Boots. Bellhaven PD, Holding Division. The voice on the other end didn't offer a name or an agency this time. It didn't need to. Boots. This is a courtesy call. In 11 minutes, 3 federal vehicles are going to arrive at your station. When they do, whoever is in charge of that building needs to have every piece of paperwork related to tonight's arrest sitting on a desk, untouched, unaltered, ready to be handed over. Boots. That's the only instruction I'm going to give you. Do you understand? Sandoval's grip tightened on the receiver. Yes, sir. Boots. Good. The line went dead. Sandoval set the phone down slowly, like it might go off again if he moved too fast, and turned to find Kessler already watching him from across the desk, some of the color gone out of his face. Boots. 11 minutes, Sandoval said. They said 11 minutes. Kessler laughed, but it came out wrong, thinner than he meant it, missing the certainty that had carried him through the last 2 hours. Boots. Somebody's messing with us. Prank call chain. Happens all the time. 3 calls in 20 minutes isn't a prank, Dale. Boots. Sandoval rarely used his training officer's first name. He used it now on purpose. You need to think hard about what you actually have on her. Boots. What you can put in a report and defend under oath. Kessler didn't answer. Boots. He was staring past him, down the corridor, at the cell where Simone Calloway sat exactly as she had for the last 2 hours, unmoving, unbothered, her eyes now fixed not on the wall clock, but on the window near the front entrance, as though she already knew what was about to pull into the lot before anyone else in the building did. Boots. She was right. At 10:41 p.m., 3 black SUVs turned off Route 9 without using their signals, rolled through the empty visitor lot, and parked in a formation that had nothing accidental about it. One blocking the exit, one squared to the front doors, one angled to give clear sight lines to every window in the building. Boots. No lights, no sirens. Just the low, disciplined hum of engines cutting out almost in unison. Nora, watching from the front desk, felt her stomach drop, not from fear of trouble, but from the sudden physical certainty that trouble had already arrived and simply hadn't announced itself yet. Boots. Dale, she said, you need to come up here. Inside her cell, Simone allowed herself, for the first time all night, something close to a breath of relief. Boots. Not because she'd ever been afraid. She hadn't, but because the part of the job she disliked most, the part where good people got hurt for doing exactly what they'd been told to do, was almost over. Boots. Pay attention to the laminated card on that wall by the loading dock. Nobody in this story has read it yet. Boots. By the end, everybody will. The first person through the door was not a colonel and not a diplomat. It was a woman in a charcoal suit, no visible weapon, ID lanyard tucked inside her collar, walking with the unhurried economy of someone who had done this exact walk in a dozen buildings that all looked the same from the inside. Boots. Special Agent Marguerite Solis stopped at the front counter, set a leather folder down with a soft, deliberate click, and said, "I need to see Simone Calloway." Boots, now. Kessler stepped forward, some of his old certainty trying to reassemble itself on his face. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification before." Boots. "You'll get it," Solis said, sliding a federal credential across the counter without breaking eye contact, "right after you tell me why a scheduled infrastructure assessor working under a department contract has been sitting in a cell for 2 hours and 40 minutes without a single officer in this building making a 2-minute verification call that was posted, in writing, 6 feet from where you arrested her." Boots. The silence that followed had weight. Boots. It was the second frozen moment of the night. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, the overhead fluorescence buzzing the only sound in the room, and in that stillness every person present understood, at exactly the same second, that the story they'd each been telling themselves about tonight had just stopped being true. Boots. Kessler tried anyway. She refused to answer basic questions at a restricted site after hours. That's a legitimate stop under. Boots. "Under what statute exactly?" Solis asked, and for the first time all night, the question actually stopped him cold, because he didn't have one. He'd never needed one before. Not with anyone else, not in 22 years, and it had never once occurred to him that the day would come when somebody would simply ask him to name it. Boots. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out that resembled an answer. Boots. Behind him, near the break room, 2 of the night shift officers who'd drifted over to watch found somewhere else to look at exactly the same moment, and that too was its own small, ugly confession, the sound of an entire room quietly deciding, all at once, which side of the story it wanted to have been standing on. Boots. "Officer." Solis didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I've read the incident log Miss Faulkner faxed to our office 9 minutes ago." Boots. "I've listened to the recording of your first phone call. I know exactly what you were told, and exactly when you were told it, and exactly what you did with that information, which was nothing." Boots. She turned toward the corridor. "Open the cell." Nora moved before Kessler could answer, keys already in her hand, and the moment she turned the lock and the door swung open, Simone Calloway stepped out into the corridor light. Not rushed, not triumphant, simply present, the way she had been present through every version of the last 3 hours. Boots. "Miss Calloway," Solis said, "I apologize for the delay. Your assessment window has been rescheduled for tomorrow at 0600. Director Kent is waiting outside to speak with you directly." Boots. Simone nodded once. She didn't look at Kessler. That, more than anything he'd feared in the last 20 minutes, was what finally broke through. The fact that she didn't even need to. Boots. "For what it's worth," she said, glancing instead at Sandoval, who stood frozen by the break room door. "You were the only person in this building tonight who looked like he wanted to do something different." Boots. "I noticed that." Sandoval said nothing. He couldn't. Something in his throat had closed around every word he might have used. Boots. He thought, standing there, of the exact second he could have stepped between them near the loading dock. Not physically, just a single sentence, Dale. Let's just call the number. And how that sentence had sat fully formed on his tongue for 3 full seconds before he'd swallowed it back down out of 4 months of habit and a training officer's reputation for making rookies regret second-guessing him. Boots. 3 seconds. He would replay them more times than he'd ever admit to anyone, including, eventually, a review board that asked him directly why he hadn't spoken up sooner. Boots. He gave them the honest answer. "I was 24 days from the end of my probationary period, and I was scared of what happens to rookies who make their training officer look bad in front of someone he's already decided is the enemy." Boots. Nobody in that room told him it was a good excuse. Nobody told him it was a bad one either. Boots. They just wrote it down because it was true, and because it was the same excuse that had let this exact scene happen in 2 other cities, to 2 other people, in the 6 years before Simone Calloway ever stood in that parking lot. Boots. Kessler, still standing at the counter, still holding the dead weight of a report he now understood would never hold up to a single question under oath, found his voice one more time. Because men like Dale Kessler always find their voice one more time, even standing in the wreckage of the thing that voice had built. Boots. "I was doing my job," he said. She wouldn't cooperate. That's not on me. Solis looked at him the way you look at a man who has just handed you, unprompted, the exact sentence you needed for your report. Boots. Write that down, she said quietly, word for word. You're going to be asked to repeat it a great many times over the next 11 weeks. Boots. Outside, under floodlights that had turned the visitor lot into something closer to daylight, Director Rosalind Kent stood beside the lead SUV in a wool coat, despite the mild October night, arms crossed, watching the front doors the way a person watches a door they've been waiting a long time to see open. Boots. When Simone walked out, Kent didn't rush to her either. She simply exhaled, one long breath, the kind that had clearly been held since a phone call 90 minutes earlier, and said, "You good?" Boots. "I'm good," Simone said. "Wasted 3 hours I didn't have. I know, I'll get you the paperwork tonight, so tomorrow's window still counts." Boots. Kent's eyes moved past her, toward the station doors, toward Kessler now visible through the glass, still talking, still explaining, to nobody who was listening anymore. Boots. "Does he know yet what tonight actually is?" "No," Simone said. "I don't think men like that ever really do." Boots. "Not until it's already happened to them." Back inside, the two agents who'd arrived with Solis were already at the booking counter, pulling files, requesting the last 6 years of arrest logs signed off by Officer Dale Kessler. Boots. It was routine protocol for any use-of-force review, connected to a federal contact. Nobody in that building thought, in that first hour, that it would turn into anything more than paperwork. Boots. They were wrong. And the thing that made them wrong was sitting in a drawer 3 feet from where Nora Faulkner was standing. Boots. While the agents worked, Nora, still turning the last 2 hours over in her mind, still hearing is she safe echo somewhere behind her sternum, pulled the county's personnel archive without anyone asking her to. Boots. It took 4 minutes to find what she hadn't thought to look for until tonight. 2 prior complaints against Dale Kessler, both closed without action, both following the exact same pattern. Boots. A raised voice, a refusal to verify, a tone of voice mistaken deliberately for a threat. She printed both pages and set them, without a word, on the growing stack in front of Agent Solis. Boots. Solis read the first page, then the second. Something in her expression didn't so much change as settle, the look of a person confirming a suspicion rather than discovering a surprise. Boots. This wasn't tonight, she said quietly, mostly to herself. This was just the night somebody finally noticed. Boots. By midnight, Kessler was being walked to a waiting vehicle. Not in cuffs, not yet, but escorted all the same, past the 3 black SUVs still parked in their silent formation, past a small cluster of night shift officers gathered near the break room window who found, when he looked their way, that they suddenly couldn't quite meet his eyes. Boots. He didn't look back at them either. The internal review took 11 weeks. Simone Calloway sat for exactly 1 formal interview, answered every question in the same measured voice she'd used inside that cell, and declined every reporter who called her afterward. Boots. The story broke anyway. Nora's printed pages, Sandoval's body camera audio, and 3 separate bystander videos from that parking lot did the work no press conference ever could have. Boots. And once the review opened, it didn't stay contained to one night. Boots. 2 earlier complaints against Kessler resurfaced from a drawer where they'd been quietly filed and forgotten. A delivery driver held 40 minutes for asking why he'd been stopped. A 19-year-old detained overnight for what the original write-up called insufficient eye contact and respect for authority. Boots. Neither complaint had gone anywhere the first time. Both did now. The County Oversight Board opened a full review of every arrest Kessler had personally documented across the previous 6 years. Boots. 211 files. Most held up under scrutiny. 14 did not. Reading through those 14 files, one after another, Agent Solis noticed something that never made it into any press release, though it sat underneath every finding in her final report. The pattern wasn't really about who Kessler stopped. Boots. It was about who he decided within the first 30 seconds had already disrespected him. A judgment he made almost entirely on tone, on posture, on how quickly a person answered a question he felt entitled to have answered instantly. Boots. 14 different people, 14 different nights, and in every single file the same phrase showed up in his own handwriting, nearly word for word. Subject's attitude escalated the situation. Boots. Not one of those 14 files contained a single documented instance of anyone raising a hand, a weapon, or even their voice. Boots. The only thing that had escalated, every time, was Dale Kessler's certainty that he was owed something the moment he asked for it. Boots. One of those 14 belonged to a woman named Marisol Ortiz, who'd spent a night in a cell 4 years earlier for the same offense as Simone, declining to explain herself fast enough for an officer who'd already decided what her silence meant. Boots. Ortiz had been 31 at the time, driving home from a double shift at a hospital pharmacy, pulled over 2 blocks from her own house for what the original report called a taillight violation that no later inspection ever confirmed. Boots. She had lost that job over the arrest. A pharmacy license under review doesn't wait patiently for a county to admit it made a mistake, and had spent 4 years since then telling almost no one what had happened, because the one time she'd tried, a cousin had told her, gently, that fighting it would only make things worse for her. Boots. When Nora's report reached her by certified letter, she read it standing in her kitchen, and had to sit down halfway through the second paragraph. Boots. She got a formal apology, a corrected record, and, for the first time since it happened, someone with actual authority telling her plainly, in writing, that she had been right and the department had been wrong. Boots. The obstruction charge Kessler had invented in the holding block, the one he'd said out loud, just to feel like he still had a lever to pull, became its own small case study during the review. Boots. Solis's team had pulled the booking paperwork he'd filed that same night, and the added charges weren't on it, because even in the heat of the moment, some old, buried instinct in him had known better than to put that lie on paper where it could be checked. Boots. He'd said it to intimidate a woman standing quietly behind bars, and then he'd walked away and never written it down, which meant, in the review board's language, that he had knowingly threatened a false charge as a coercive tactic. Boots. That single sentence, spoken and never filed, ended up carrying almost as much weight in his final hearing as the 2-hour detention itself. Boots. It was the kind of detail that made even his own union representative go quiet reading the transcript. Kessler didn't fight the plea agreement his attorney eventually negotiated: loss of certification, a permanent bar from law enforcement anywhere in the state, no criminal time. Boots. It was the calculus of a man whose 30 years of reading people had in the end been read correctly by everyone else, long before he understood it about himself. Boots. He gave no statement to the 2 local news cameras that sat parked outside his house for most of a week. Boots. His attorney had advised silence, and for maybe the first time in longer than either of them could say, Dale Kessler actually listened. Boots. But even in the closing paperwork, even with his certification already surrendered, he wrote one final line into his own defense statement, the one his attorney tried and failed to talk him out of. I stand by my instincts that night. Boots. I'd make the same call again. It was the sentence that ended any chance of leniency, and it was, in its own way, the truest thing he said through the entire process, because it told everyone in that review room exactly what they needed to know. Boots. Some men don't lose their certification because of one bad night. They lose it because one bad night was finally the night somebody was paying close enough attention to see the pattern underneath it. Boots. Sandoval stayed on. Under the interim command that followed, he was the first officer to volunteer for the department's new verification protocol, a simple rule, almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight, requiring any officer who questioned a person's stated authorization to make the confirming phone call before escalating, never after. Boots. He kept a printed copy of his own body camera transcript in his desk drawer for a long time, not as evidence anymore, but as a reminder of the 4 minutes where he'd known something was wrong and hadn't said it loud enough. Boots. Nora kept doing the job she'd always done, except now there was a laminated card taped beside her phone with a single line she'd written herself in blue marker. When in doubt, make the call. Boots. She thought often, in the months after, about how close she'd come to simply filing that first Calloway exactly as instructed, exactly the way she'd filed 1,000 strange calls before it, and how the only difference that night had been a question she couldn't quite let go of afterward. Is she safe? A question nobody had ever asked her about anyone sitting in that holding block before, in 6 years at that desk. Boots. She started asking it herself now, out loud, every time a name came across her line that didn't sound like it belonged to a routine drunken disorderly. Boots. Most nights the answer was yes, and that was fine. She only needed it to matter once. Belhaven's new interim chief, a career administrator named Miriam Ostrander, who had spent most of her 20 years in oversight rather than patrol, gave exactly one public statement, and she didn't try to soften what had happened. Boots. She said the department had failed. She said the failure had a pattern behind it, and that fixing a pattern takes far longer than firing one man, and that the work wouldn't continue whether or not anyone was still watching by the time it finished. Boots. It wasn't a triumphant speech. It wasn't meant to be. It was honest, and in a department that hadn't heard much honesty from its own leadership in a long time, that counted for something. Boots. 8 months later, Simone found herself driving past the Belhaven Annex on her way to an unrelated assessment 2 counties over. Boots. She hadn't planned to stop. But the building looked different in daylight than it had that night. Smaller, almost unremarkable. The kind of squat brick block nobody looks at twice, which she supposed had always been the point of buildings like that. Boots. She parked anyway. Sandoval was outside on a break when he recognized her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the silence carrying more weight than either of them probably intended. Boots. I wasn't sure you'd ever come back through here, he said finally. I wasn't sure either, Simone admitted. I think I wanted to see if it still felt the same. Boots. Does it? She considered the question the way she considered most things, carefully, without performing an answer for anyone's benefit. Boots. No, she said. It feels like a place that's still figuring itself out. That's not nothing. Sandoval glanced back toward the doors, then at her, some old, unresolved weight visibly still sitting on him. Boots. I keep thinking about the 4 minutes, he said. How I knew, how I didn't do anything with knowing. You did something 2 hours later. Boots. That's more than most people manage the first time, Simone said. It was an absolution, and she hadn't offered it as one. But something in the way she said it seemed to loosen something in him anyway, the particular relief of being told, by the one person with the most right to withhold it, that a mistake didn't have to be the whole story. Boots. For what it's worth, he said, the new check-in protocol, it's got your incident number attached to the training file. Boots. Every new officer reads it. Not your name, just the situation. What should have happened at minute 4, instead of minute 120? Boots. Simone looked toward the building for a long moment, the afternoon light catching flat and gold against its brick face, unremarkable the way it was always meant to look. Boots. Beside the loading dock, the after-hours contact placard was still there, except now it sat inside a small frame, a line of new text stenciled beneath the original phone number. Call first. Boots. Every time. Good, she said quietly. That's what actually matters, not what happened to me. What happens to the next person standing where I was standing? Boots. She got back in her car, and Sandoval watched her pull out of the lot and merge onto Route 9, unhurried, the way she'd moved through every version of that night. Never rushing toward vindication, only ever waiting, patiently, for the truth to catch up to where she'd already been standing the whole time. Boots. What happened in Belhaven that night was never really about one officer or one arrest. It was about how quickly authority curdles into abuse the moment nobody is required to check it, and how long that abuse can survive when the people standing closest to it decide silence is safer than speaking up. Boots. Simone Calloway never raised her voice. She never demanded an apology. She never asked anyone to suffer for what was done to her. Boots. And that restraint was the entire point. Because dignity held quietly under pressure outlasts arrogance every single time. Arrogance needs an audience to survive. Boots. Dignity doesn't need anything at all. The real justice in this story was never Dale Kessler losing his badge. It was a rookie officer somewhere, reading a training file with no name attached to it, learning to make one phone call before making one assumption. Boots. It was a framed placard by a loading dock that used to say nothing and now says everything. Proof that one person's quiet refusal to be diminished can go on protecting people who will never know her name. Boots. If Simone's calm meant something to you, if you found yourself angry for her, and then quietly relieved for the officer who finally found his own voice too late to save the night, but just in time to change the next one, that's worth sitting with for a second before you go. Boots. Someone in your life has probably stood exactly where she stood, in some version of that room, and said the quiet, reasonable thing while nobody made the call. Boots. If this story reminded you of them, share it their way. And if you've ever been the one standing by the door, watching, knowing something was wrong, and staying quiet a little too long. Tell me which side of that room you were on. Boots. I read every answer.